So this is number 8 in our study of First John, a set of discussion starters. Really, these aren't full-fledged studies, but discussion starters. And I'm looking at the last few verses of chapter 3 and the beginning verses of chapter 4 in First John. Um, it's interesting because John changes here and uses a different greeting. Up until this point, he'd been greeting in the for dear children. And all of a sudden, in these paragraphs, he starts to use dear friends, as if he's maybe changed and is more on an equal ground with his audience. If our hearts don't condemn us, we have confidence before God and receive from him anything we ask because we obey his commands and do what pleases him. Uh, Interesting, because he's making the observation that we're agreeing with God. Uh, that all of a sudden we're on God's side, we're on God's team, if you will, and we're doing His thing instead of our own thing. And His command to believe in the name of His Son Jesus Christ and to love one another as He commanded us. Very much similar to what we had in our last study. Love one another, and that was that agape love that I was talking about. Those who obey His commands live in Him, and He in them, and this is how we know that He lives in us. We know it by the Spirit He gave us. What's interesting then, I use that as a precursor to the next piece, because he says, "Dear friends, don't believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God, because many false prophets have gone out into the world." That's very similar to what he was talking about in chapter 2. This is how you can recognize the Spirit of God. Every spirit that acknowledges that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God, but every spirit that does not acknowledge Jesus is not from God. So my discussion starter today has to do with where are you getting your news from? Where are you getting all your information from? We live in a very information age. You can get it from about anywhere. I'm a little ornery because I get my news from two different sources, at least two different sources, but I get them from polar opposite sources because I find that in the doing so, a little bit more of the truth sets in between. And I find that a lot of news sources have an agenda that they want to press us towards, and that bothers me because there was a time, at least I thought there was a time, that we could trust the news we received, that it was actually what was new happening around the world rather than coming from some commentator's political view. In this passage, it challenges us to look at the source. In other words, it's saying that if it doesn't acknowledge that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh, and that's a specific theological view, then don't believe it. That's a different filter than we put on a lot of things. That filter would even work on what we are working with in the church. In other words, uh, do they believe that Jesus Christ, that John 14:6, that is the way, the truth, and the life, that no one comes to the Father except through him? This is reflected here in John. Do you believe that Jesus Christ came, lived, preached, died in the flesh, was resurrected in the flesh, and ascended to God? If your news source doesn't agree with that, then probably you need to look for a different news source. Dear children, in verse 4, God, you, dear children, are from God and have overcome them, because the one in you is greater than the one is in the world. I also think sometimes we sift our news thinking that, well, if it's Christian, it's not quite as good, or it's not quite as complete. doesn't have quite all the nuances of the news we get maybe on our most popular media. So my question today is, how are you hearing the world around you and testing the spirit with which that news is coming to you? Because in one way or another, we are in that process weighing out our influences and our influencers. I think it's time that we think about it.